Welcome to the Holiness Today podcast. On this episode, listen to a conversation I have with Richard Giesken. Reverend Giesken is from South Africa, but has served in Australia as a minister and professor at NTC in Brisbane. In January of 2024, he was appointed to be District Superintendent of the Australian North and West District. In our conversation, Reverend Giesken talks about his faith journey, his experience as a minister, and of his perspective of the church in Australia. I'm sitting here with Richard Giesken, and he was my roommate, believe it or not. So we got to talking, and I said, let's sit down and have a conversation, and we'll record it for the podcast. So we are here recording, and this is on day 2. We've been through 3 sessions, so we've been percolating some thoughts. But Richard, just to start us off, can you tell us a little bit how God called you to salvation and to ministry, just a little bit of biographical information about yourself?
Well, I grew up in the Methodist Church in South Africa, and my story is that I went to Sunday school, but I had Sunday school every day of the week because my mum was the Sunday school teacher. So I would get, if I was any discipline, it was like, so what would Jesus do in this situation? And that was really a good legacy for me, just growing up in that situation. But I mean, there were times, there were definite times where I recognized growing up, I would always respond to an altar call because I felt like if I didn't respond that I was saying no to Jesus. And eventually I figured, actually, I don't have to go up every time that they ask for a commitment. I'm committed and moving through. And call to ministry, I never imagined that I'd go into ministry. It wasn't, I'm not the son of a prophet or anything like that. And it was only when I went to university, I became involved with a group called Campus Crusade for Christ. And through their involvement, I started thinking more about how I share my faith with others, how I become involved in some ministry within my church. And so when I went back home after university, I got involved as a local preacher in the Methodist Church. And then shortly after that, I actually joined staff with Campus Crusade, and that was sort of the start of ministry. But then I believed that if I was going to be involved in some kind of ministry, that I needed training in ministry. I couldn't just do this on, bits and pieces acquired here and there, and sort of professional development type stuff. So my wife and I believed that God was calling us to China. And so we left South Africa, where I grew up, to go to Australia to study at the Nazarene Theological College, to become educated in theology. And the idea was that Australia is in the same region as China, and that we would then be able to move into that. And part of that journey as well, then after a couple of years in Australia, a friend told us about Asia Pacific Nazarene Theological Conference. And so I went up there, and that was, like, in my mind, one step closer to China. But during that time, I was advised that before thinking about going into mission field, we need to get some pastoral training. So there was a church in Australia that at that time happened to say, we're looking for a pastor, invited us to return to Australia and pastor the church. And it was a kind of a strange situation because the church had been told we're going to be missionaries, we're going to China and whatever, and that we would only be there for 2 years. And I didn't feel like the relationship was growing with the people in the church. We were just temporary. And so I got to the point of saying to people that we will be here as long as God, the church, and the government want us to be, will allow us to be here. And that opened up the relationship with people in the church. We became part of the community. And that opened up all sorts of ministry opportunities, not just in within the church community, but the broader community as well. And that was 24 years ago. And we kind of, one story is that, God used bait and switch to get us to Australia. Because if he'd asked us to go to Australia, we probably would have said no.
Right.
The other is that we got stuck along the way. But certainly we still have a love for for China, but that ministry has never opened up.
Yeah.
And in the process, I've ended up part of my ministry is teaching at the Nazarene Theological College in Brisbane, and becoming very entrenched in the ministry of the church in Australia.
Yeah. So teaching at the college in Brisbane, do you help train missionaries that might go on to those areas? Is there still a connection where God is using you and your passion for China in Brisbane?
Not really. No.
Okay. Yeah.
No, the training of people in Brisbane is primarily for Australia.
Yeah.
We've got an exciting program. I find it very exciting, is that through our region we've begun, and through the technology of Zoom and the likes, we've actually begun a culturally and linguistically diverse program, the CALL program. And what this does is it gives us an opportunity through our accrediting agency in Australia to offer Australian degrees to people outside of Australia who do not have English as a first language. And it allows us to explore their cultural context. So we have cohorts in Fiji, in Samoa, in Papua New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and of all places, Mongolia. And so we utilize the technology and the idea is to train those who will become teachers in the area. And so primarily looking at people who are mature age, who are on leadership track, and being able to equip the leaders of those areas then to develop contextually the ministry needs of people in those areas. So that's a very exciting project to be a part of.
And you recently, during this, got elected to be district superintendent of, tell us the district, because it's a very large swath of land.
It's Australia North and West.
North and West District.
Yeah, which incorporates 3 Australian states, Western Australia, Northern Territories, and Queensland. But give you a context, Australia is the size of, more or less the size of contiguous USA. And so it is like me being in New York and having churches all the way over in Los Angeles. And there's not a lot in between. Yeah. So to fly it's a 5-hour flight to go and spend some time with the churches on the West Coast. So I think second to Russia, Australia North and West is the second largest geographic district in the world. Yeah.
What are some of your strategies and things you're thinking about connectivity of such a large and spread out district?
Yes, that is. I think geography is our enemy. Yeah. And figuring out ways to work through that. One of the sessions yesterday was on togetherness. And so I asked someone, what does it mean for us to be together with a church 4,000 kilometres away? Yeah. How do we build that sense of oneness and oneness in mission and direction? And we have means. Of course, technology is great, using the phone, using Zoom to connect with people. Our district assembly, this past district assembly, we had 3 sites that were connected through Zoom. And I actually felt such a togetherness, even though we were using the technology in that way, probably more togetherness than previous district assemblies where some people were physically present together. Yeah. But distance and expense of travelling is always going to be an issue. Whereas having the 3 centres allowed more people to gather into those centres.
Because they didn't have to compromise on traveling far. Yeah.
So there's those ways. What I have in mind, and I still haven't figured out how we might even finance this. But as I travel through the district, to not do it alone. To take leaders with me, to take pastors, to take lay people with me, to take NDI presidents, and travel and the idea that I have in my mind is slowly stirring the waters. Yeah. And allowing people to connect with each other throughout the year. so that when we do come to those gathering times for district assembly, that we've actually had time together through the year. There's been a lot of good work done before me in trying to make these connections. It's not a, I think our district, so we used to be, Western Australia was a pioneer district and the East Coast was a district. And about 9 years ago, those two districts were merged into one to become.
So how many churches are in that geographic area?
About 20.
Okay, and they're mostly on the east and west coast?
I think we've got 4 or 5 on the west coast.
Okay.
And then the rest are on the east coast.
Okay.
Yeah. And so our furthest south is 600 kilometres south of Brisbane, and the furthest north is about 1,000 kilometres north of Brisbane, and then about 200 kilometres in.
So in travel, you're pretty much going to cover the whole Australia, because when you fly, you'll cross over. Yeah. That's
there's still a huge population in our district that has no Nazarene representation, and particularly in the Northern Territory, we don't have any church or any.
Right.
Yeah.
So what is the biggest takeaway so far? And we're halfway through that you're going to take back with you to Australia, and it's inspiring, and you're thinking on, or a question that you're still just processing through? Yeah,
I think this idea of togetherness that we discussed, to me, it's a challenging word, because as we've discussed the concepts, I'm more used to talking in terms of unity. But as we discussed, the idea that togetherness brings a broader understanding. However, there's still that aspect of togetherness in my mind that says we can be, togetherness is just proximity.
Yeah.
But what we want in the church is more than just proximity. We actually want a sense of belonging to one another, a sense of being in common mission together, being connected in somehow or another. So figuring out what is going to promote that and expand that. So, certainly one of the areas that we would love to explore and figure out how to do that is to grow our missional networks. We've essentially got 3 geographic centres in our district, and how we can grow those missional networks so that they, I wouldn't say become self-sustaining, but there's a level of support for each other in those places that builds a momentum forward. And there's some interesting projects that are happening across the district that we're trying to resource and support and see how the Lord can use that to grow the church. Bearing in mind, Australia is probably one. The society is very secular, and there is a certain amount of hostility towards the gospel, but the biggest response by far is one of indifference. That religion's good for you, but it's just not my thing, and I'm not interested. I'm not interested in what you're selling, and people would rather spend time on the beach or go camping and the whole outdoor life. We've got a beautiful climate to be able to do that in, and between. So the Australian philosophy of life is that we work to live, not live to work. And so people work really hard, but then we also have a lot of free time. And the moment you have any free time, you're out. You don't want to be serving at the church. No. You want to be doing, And anything that takes you away from your family is not going to be appreciated. I think one of the great Australian values is this idea of family life together. And so Christmas and Easter become family times. So in many countries where you have an influx of people into church, Australia's the opposite. We have an exit of people from the churches at those times. And that might not, that's my experience of it. Might not be all over in Australia, but so finding those dynamics that build into the natural flow of the culture, and how we can enrich people's lives with the good news, and build around that is the big challenge.
Is that, in your understanding, is that how Australia has always been, or is that a new thing? Is there an encroachment of secularization, or has it kind of always been that way in Australian culture?
I think there's always been an element of that. I remember as a student at Nazarene Theological College in Brisbane, one of the students in my class started his presentation in this way, that the founding fathers of Australia came with very different convictions than the founding fathers of America. And of course, the
it was a penal colony.
It was a penal colony.
Yeah.
They had like prison convictions.
Right.
And so there's
That's good.
There is this.
I didn't catch the convictions at first, but that's good. I'm going to use that.
There is that narrative of the convict history, and some of that was so you have stories of William Marsden. I think it was William Marsden, who. On Sunday he was the pastor of the colony, but on Monday through Friday he was the magistrate handing out lashes. So how does that express the love of God to people? And so this confusion between state and religion was not very good for the early elements. A lot of politics that go into that as well. And one of the other things that there's a great book called Australian Soul that speaks about the sociology of religion in Australia by Gary Boehmer. And he speaks about this idea in Australia, our monarch, who's King Charles III, is very far away and doesn't particularly have any influence in our life. We love him dearly, as long as he stays in England. And so our concept of God
is similar to that.
His way off there, we know he loves us, but it doesn't really affect our life that much. And so there's that element within religion in Australia. But I think also, I think in the US you have that in the Pacific Northwest, the whole rugged self-determinism, make your own way. Some people have said, the Pacific Northwest is very similar to Australian culture in that way. So a fierce individualism, stand on your own 2 feet, religion is a crutch, all those ideas. But I think the predominant sort of idea is that of indifference.
So in successful cases, what have churches done to bring people in? What are the strategies that they use to get families to come on Easter and things like that that you've noticed?
It's a very slow process, and it's very relational. As you build relationships of trust and inclusion, I think that's something that's been helpful. One of our churches in a city called Bundaberg, they've just recently begun a ministry in the cost of living crisis. Somebody donated some clothes to the church. They don't have a thrift shop or anything like that. But so they had these clothes and they're trying to figure out what to do with it. And so they thought, well, they'll open it to the public. People can come take whatever they want. And I think 12 people turned up and they took things. Over the next month, they got a whole lot more donations. So they opened the doors again. And one of the recent opportunities that they had, times that they had this ministry called the Clothes Basket, had over 400 people come through the church. And amazing what, Pastor Kelvin Rowland is doing in that, Pastor Kelvin and his wife Katrina. They've involved volunteers who are not members of the church, who are not even Christian. And so by working alongside them, they're building relationship with the volunteers. On the Sunday that I preached in the church, there was a person who had been to the Clothes Basket the day before, who was in church on Sunday. So, it's one here, one there. Relationships, you can only sustain so many relationships. And so it's a slow build. But I think as people experience a genuine love and care and concern for them, they respond to that in exploring faith. And I think recently, as I've been listening to people's story of coming to faith, there's been the one common theme that runs through is that someone took time to care for me, and that led to a relationship with Christ. Now that can take 3, 4, 5 years to develop, and if we're seeing people simply as marks for the gospel, our targets recognise that they have become projects and they don't respond well to them. So it has to be, in NDI we talk about authentic relationships. And that has to be at the core of everything we do. And then trust the Spirit to work through our relationships to the people that we're meeting. In my own local church, we began with this idea that the barbecue is a very underutilized evangelism tool. Open your home. And actually we had a work and witness team that had come through with this idea that divide the group into 4, and they'll go to somebody's house for a barbecue, but invite all your friends and family along to the barbecue. And somewhere during that, somebody will give a testimony. That's it. That's all that was done. And then that allowed us to follow up with people. So I hesitate with the word strategy and relationship because then
it feels inauthentic.
Then the relationship is a means to an end. But no, the relationship is the goal. And as we develop a relationship with people, that it's genuine. So we decided we didn't have a youth group in our church. Our son was sort of getting into that high school age. We wanted to start doing something, so we started this once a month barbecue and invited the neighbours, physical neighbours around the church to come and join in. Well, 1 or 2 came once or twice, but that wasn't really... People in the church started inviting their friends along, and our kids started inviting their friends along. That group grew. And some of the friends that had been invited started inviting their friends. And so we're not talking large numbers. On a good night we'd have 50 people, around the barbecue, cooking hamburgers, whatever. And we'll always have an inspirational talk. 10, 15 minutes, just sharing something positive. Sometimes it was about dementia care in the community. And then as we built the relationship with this group of people that stabilized over time, we started sharing Bible stories. And out of the Bible stories, bringing life lessons. So very low key, not a hard sell of, come to the altar and confess your sins type of situation. But just building relationships. And over the course of time, we just on Easter Sunday at the beginning of the year, I had a young lad come to me who's been in fellowship with us for about 7 years now, gone through a really dark time in his life, felt the love and support of the church, and on Sunday morning had said to us, please share my story, and that's why I feel free to actually share this. So he came to me at the beginning of the year and said, I'd like to be baptized. And so I said, sure, great, come, let's do this. And so Easter Sunday was designated as the time that we would baptize him, and he invited his family, and we all gathered on the beach, and he was baptized. But part of the story as well is between him asking to be baptized, he'd been chatting to his younger brother about Jesus. And came to me, a couple of weeks afterwards, a couple of weeks after he'd asked to be baptized, and said, my younger brother wants to be baptized as well. So I had the privilege of baptizing the 2 brothers. It's like discipleship in action right there. That not a lot of knowledge, not a lot of but a great passion for following Jesus and just sharing that. And the two of them now are learning together and growing in Jesus.
So do you find with new Christians that there's more of an urgency or fervor to kind of get out and meet others, or is it about is it that cultural kind of similar throughout because it's built on, kind of long trajectory relationships?
I think that, yeah.
I mean, do you think when he got baptized, he immediately thought, I need to get my brother in, or do you think it just kind of was?
I think it's just a natural flow of conversation.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of it, more of it depends on personality types.
Yeah.
But certainly new Christians have got a lot more friends who are not in the church or who don't have any faith. And that opens up possibilities to talk about Jesus.
Yeah.
Most of the people in my circle, have a sign outside their door saying, not hiring, not interested.
Not interested.
So we already kind of had that conversation. Yeah. But there's nothing wrong with exploring those areas again, because people change.
Yeah.
I think that actually just really interesting and helpful discussion at lunch today with a brother from Trinidad, and talking about his mentoring of young men. He's a pastor, and he finds these young men selling coconuts on the street, and spends time just, greeting them, building relationship, and then sharing life together, and a very genuine, authentic building relationship as a father to a son. And in that process, there's an influence of life. And I asked him kind of what is the, not exactly what is the secret, but that idea of listening, and listening long enough to earn the right to speak into someone's life, which really impacted me. How long and how do you genuinely listen to people's stories? So one of the things that we have in our doctrine is prevenient grace, and I'm asking myself the question: how do we recognize prevenient grace in someone's life? Yeah. And how do we help that person recognize prevenient grace in their own life? Yeah. Because I think if we can get people to recognize, that goodness that you feel in your life, that sense of freedom that you have, that's actually God's Spirit at work in you. Yeah. And when you recognize it, then you know what you're looking for, and so you see more of it. It's like, I don't know if you play the game Spotto with the kids. So that as you're driving around, if you see a yellow car, you shout Spotto. Yeah. And it's amazing when you start looking for yellow cars, how many you see.
Yeah, a lot more. Yeah.
You'll notice that now, right?
Yeah.
Every time you pass a yellow car, you're going to think about me. Yeah. And so similarly, if we help people recognize what God's doing in their life,
moments of grace in life,
and then it's not us who convert people. It's not our strategies that are going to convince people. It's the Holy Spirit at work in people's lives, and we know that the Holy Spirit is already at work in people's lives. Yeah. How do we help them respond to what the Spirit is already doing? And as they respond to the little grace, they discover more grace until they are overwhelmed by grace and respond with a life of obedience and a life of growth, of learning. And that's one of the things that my new friend from Trinidad spoke about is he knows that he's only got 24 hours in a day. So he builds his program with knowing these people in mind. Yeah. How can I include them in my life? Right. Which to me is, that is laying down your life for us, is actually thinking, how can I include people in what I do?
One of the questions that was asked, and I thought it was an interesting question, and I think it is very interesting to think about the context of Australia. And I can't remember how it was phrased, so I'll just rephrase it for myself. But the gist of the question was, how do we delineate when a church is a church? So the marks of the church, the classic marks of the church: the Word of God's preached, sacraments rightly administered, there's discipline, the Reformation marks. But it is interesting to think about in those situations that very well indeed could be considered a church. It's a gathering. It's a gathering of people called out together, even if it's called out to have barbecue. So in some sense, it is an ecclesia. But
where two or three are gathered in my name.
Right.
There I am.
And that's the purpose of your gathering and inviting your neighbors. So,
a number of years ago, Robert Putnam wrote a book, Bowling Alone, and talking about the decline of community and social cohesion in the Western world, and saying that at the time the book was written, more people were 10-pin bowling than ever before, but fewer bowling leagues existed than ever before.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of thing that we're seeing. I have friends who go to the movies by themselves. And I don't comprehend that.
Yeah.
Like, I would never go to a movie by myself. That's something I do at least with my wife, if not with the family or something like that. But so the social cohesion, I think, in the West, with the individualism that we have, people do things by themselves, or with a small group. So large gatherings of people is just,
even that's
it's strange to the culture. And so trying to work through how do we find new expressions of the church? What does that look like? What does that mean? A genuine, authentic. And in some of our discussion in our small groups, Svetlana was talking about the communion table. And communion, the Lord's Supper, has always been the central element of Christian worship. And everything is around that table. And everything grows out around that table. And perhaps it's a revisiting. What does that table look like to us? What does it mean to us? And even in our discussions today, we're talking about brokenness and what that looks like. And remembering that, Jesus takes the bread, he blesses it, he breaks it, and he gives it. And that's symbolic of the life of Christ. He is blessed, he is broken, and he's given for the world. And if we are to be Christ-like, then to what extent are we taken, broken, and given to the world? And in our small, Tim Gaines was talking about, the wounds of Christ, and even the gash in his side becomes the entry point. He says, put your hand in my side. And that becomes an openness. And yet we hide our brokenness. We hide those places of vulnerability from people. And what if our vulnerability allows people to be vulnerable themselves and open up and share life together? So just another thought that I had, so there's a great writer on evangelism in the Australian context called Sam Chan, and he said some really things that have shaped my thinking on evangelism in the Australian context. And one of those is just pointing out that Asian youth in Australia are leaving traditional Chinese religions and finding freedom in Christ. But our Anglo-Australian youth are leaving the church to find freedom. And what's wrong with this picture, that we feel like we need to get out from church to find a freedom, and yet others are finding freedom in the church. And sometimes, but our salvation is not the church, our salvation is Christ. So is it that we've become church, we've become an institution rather than a living relationship with Christ, and what that means in the way that we live our daily lives. How is, for want of a better word, religion practiced in the home? How do we do faith with our children? How do we form faith in our children becomes a crucial question as well. We often outsource that to the church. So here's our kids for Sunday school hour. You make them Christian. And it's our responsibility to do that. They are our first disciples. Sam Chan also talks about this, the church being a plausible community and an expression of the new people that God is creating, the new creation. And what does that look like? And again, that theme of togetherness that we've spoken about, where there's a sense of we love each other.
Yeah.
And that to me is like that Friday night, once a month gathering that we have around the barbecue. People who are not necessarily members of the church or connected to the church in any way, they find a place of belonging there, and they keep coming back to that place and identify. And it opens up such conversations in that space. That is it the church? Probably not by the marks of the church. Are people being ministered to? Absolutely.
Well, in a closing thought, or you can take as long as you want on this. What are your prayers or your hopes for Australia? I mean, what would you say? This is strategy. I agree is probably the wrong word, but what is your as God is talking to you? What is He helping you see or hope for your district or Australia, or even just the church of the Global Church of Nazarene or the global church?
Yeah. I think, my role as district superintendent is just so new still. I'm just trying to get my head around what that actually means. And one of the... I asked someone at a breakfast table, as a district superintendent, what would you advise a young district starting out DS to do? And the idea was be a pastor to the pastors, which is I think great advice. It's not institutional; it's relational. Again, my hope and dream for the church in Australia is I think we've got great theology. I think we've got and that great theology actually has potential to do great good in our society, especially in those areas of loneliness and bringing people to a sense of freedom. But how do we connect to people outside of the church? So I think that's one of my prayers is, Lord, open us up to others. Help us not to hold this thing so precious that we feel like we need to protect it from the outside.
Right.
I think that we can discover genuine community, what that means. Part of my studies were done in the Philippines, and growing up in Africa and seeing community in the Philippines, and then coming back into a Western community, recognizing that we really don't understand community and what it means to be together from that sense, and trying to figure out how do you build that sense of community within your community or within your society. So one of the marks of growth in my own local church that I saw, if we can do more of this, great. So we have morning tea after church, and a lot of people stay there. So to me, a great service is when people stay long after morning tea. Nobody's rushing off. People are just sitting around chatting and being in fellowship. But then also, I noticed that people started having lunch together and meeting each other for coffee during the week. And so all of a sudden, so being a club means that you intersect for one purpose in life. Being a community means that your lives intersect in multiple places through the week.
Yeah.
And so to see people's lives intersecting at multiple places and outside of the religious structures, there's community beginning to happen. And that to me is exciting. We place such a lot of emphasis on the thinking part of our faith, the cognitive aspect, but we don't place a lot of value on the affective or the emotional component of our faith, that sense of trust, that sense of connection, relationship with people, which I think we underestimate how influential we can be on people in our relationships.
Clubs intersect at one point in your life.
At one point in
Communities intersect
multiple
points, and organically.
Yeah.
In a non-scheduled way. That's good. Thank you for listening to the Holiness Today podcast. If you enjoyed this production and wish to hear more, visit holinesstoday.org/podcast or find us on Spotify, Apple, and Google Podcasts.